Well, let's turn now to 1 Thessalonians, which has, of course, played a significant role in Pentecostal and evangelical understandings of the end times. What we're going to find, I believe, though, is when we get to the eschatological passage of 1 Thessalonians in chapter 4, there is a lot that meets the eye. In fact, a guy named John Darby, who was a Brit, about the time of the American Civil War in the 19th century, has largely taught us how to read 1 Thessalonians 4. And I would suggest to you that his reading was 100% incorrect. More on that when we get there. First, let's look at the structure of 1 Thessalonians and try to get a sense for how Paul intentionally lays out this letter. Well, first, there's introductory material in the first 10 verses, and we've grown accustomed to the way Paul introduces his letters as we've looked at Romans, 1 Corinthians, and Philippians. And what I hope you've noticed is that Paul always includes key themes and vocabulary in what looks to be insignificant material. It looks like it's just a formal greeting, but Paul is plowing ground that he will later come in and backfill by reconnecting rhetorically to those same vocabulary words and themes. So in chapter 1, verses 1 through 10, Paul greets and gives thanks for the Thessalonians' model of faith. And he does this in 6 ways. First, he remembers the Thessalonians' love, faith, and endurance, coupled with the Thessalonians' remembrance of Paul's ministry among them. You get this interplay in verse 4 between we know and verse 5, you know. In Greek, you know is oidete. And it's going to appear 9 times in 1 Thessalonians. It only appears that many times in 1 Corinthians, which is, of course, a much longer letter. So that's a central feature that Paul is sharing with the Thessalonians what they both agree on. We know and you know. You know, over and over and over again. He's reminding them of the ground that they share. Secondly, there was great suffering involved in the Thessalonians' reception of the Word. And when we get to reconstructing the relationship between Paul and the Thessalonians, we'll touch on that briefly. Third, this is the only church in verse 7 that Paul calls a model, tupos in Greek. Fourth, this church consists of ex-idol worshipers. In verse 9, they tell us how you turn to God from ikoi, from statues, to serve the living and true God. And then in verse 10, we get a succinct summary of Paul's eschatological message, to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath. Now, what I want you to see is in those first 10 verses, particularly verses 5 and 6, there are 2 references to the Holy Spirit. Why does that matter? Because Paul seems to be reminding the Thessalonians in these opening verses of the message that he had preached to them initially. And so the fact that the Holy Spirit plays a prominent role in this passage indicates to us that the Holy Spirit played a prominent role in Paul's early preaching to the Thessalonians. So that certainly should matter to our pneumatology. Okay, in the second section, I'm saying it's between 2:1 and 3:5. Paul defends his ministry to the Thessalonians. And the reason that I'm bracketing that section between 2:1 and 3:5 is that there's a natural bracket that Paul provides. It's called an inclusio. And that bracket is in vain. We find in vain in 2:1 and then in vain again in 3:5, indicating rhetorically that we should treat this as a unit, which is the first fill in the blank there. Second, Paul has been accused by some of flattery, greed, and perhaps dishonorable menial labor. Paul is a tent maker. He was looked down on by many. Menial labor, especially from the elite point of view, was considered dishonorable. Flattery was a topos. Remember that from Philippians? It was a stock category that you used to criticize your enemies. And it's the only place that it shows up in Paul's letters here at 1 Thessalonians. He's accused of being a flatterer in 2 verse 5. In response, number 3, Paul calls God in 2:5 and the Thessalonians in 2:10 as witnesses of his behavior, employing the metaphor of wet nurse in 2:7 and father 2:11 through 12. It's sad that a few feminist scholars have criticized Paul for using completely androcentric language, and they've overlooked metaphors like this where Paul sees himself both as mother and father over the Thessalonian congregation. Number 4, Thessalonian believers are imitators of Paul and the Judean churches And 5, Timothy is sent to calm any disturbance over Paul's suffering, which is a recurring pattern in the ministry of Paul. He's sending Timothy or he's receiving Timothy. The next section is 3, verses 6 through 13, in which Timothy brings good news about the faith and love of the Thessalonians. So it's similar to Philippians in that sense that we have this exchange in the middle of the letter between Paul and his co-workers. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, Paul reminds the Thessalonians of his former preaching on sanctified living. This sanctified living covered Gentile issues, not Jewish issues. Control of the body, brotherly love, honorable work. So we get a sense for the Pauline ethic being worked out among this very Gentile congregation. In chapter 4, verses 13 and 18, Paul clarifies his teaching on the parousia in relation to those that have died. This letter is so early, and there was such a fervent expectation of the parousia, the second coming of Christ occurring any minute, that it throws this congregation into a tailspin when some of their Christian brothers and sisters began to die. They didn't expect that to happen. They think that the entire Christian message which they have believed is suddenly in jeopardy simply based on the fact that some Christians are beginning to die. So Paul has to come in and explain to them his eschatology more fully. In chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, Paul reminds the Thessalonians of the imminence of the parousia. He doesn't want them to think simply because God has a plan for deceased Christians that it's going to be long. They all still believe it will come any moment like a thief in the night. And then finally in chapter 5, verses 12 to 28, there is a closing, what we might call paranesis, which simply means ethical instruction. And then there is a closing farewell also. 3 theological emphases I'd like to bring out. First, of course, is the imminent second coming of Jesus to renew and to reorder the earth. I want you to notice that at the end of chapter 4, the end of this description about being caught up to meet the Lord in the air, there's no talk about going to heaven. This is not rapture. This is escorting Jesus back down to earth to rule and to reign over his domain. And in fact, I've written a paper, and I would suggest to you that Paul is using the language of imperial visitation, of the once-in-a-lifetime moment in which the emperor might visit your city. And in that carefully choreographed event, the notables of the town would exit the city to meet the emperor, same word that Paul uses for meeting the Lord in the air, meet the emperor outside the city walls, to then escort the Caesar back into the city for a parade and for a celebration. This is not Paul depicting us all flying off to heaven to some celestial paradise to get away from the mess on earth. Not at all. This is Jesus coming to rule and to reign over his creation and to set it anew again. Number 2, the second theological emphasis is the response of faith to the content of the gospel. Pistis, faith. It's littered throughout 1 Thessalonians. We often attribute that to Romans alone, but in this much shorter, much more situational, nitty-gritty letter, faith, faith, faith is front and center. And number 3, the reality of suffering in the transmission and the reception of the gospel is heavily emphasized in this community in Thessalonica. A few historical features as well to highlight under Roman numeral 3. Number 1, 1 Thessalonians is the earliest document that we have in the New Testament, perhaps written between 48 and 52 AD. Number 2, you'll see that I've included in your outline a reconstruction of Paul's relationship with the Thessalonians. The book of Acts helps us out with this. And I also want to call your attention to page 80 of Burridge, because Burridge does something very fascinating there. He looks at the evidence in 1 Thessalonians and he reconstructs what might have been Paul's original sermon, his original preaching content to this group that became the first church of Thessalonica. Have a look at that. It's quite compelling. Let's talk about the canonical significance of 1 Thessalonians. It certainly has a vital role to play in the New Testament canon. First, 1 Thessalonians has no Old Testament quotations, not one, which depicts how this formerly Jewish gospel so quickly conformed to the Gentile world. Isn't that amazing? That the earliest Christian document has no Old Testament references. Simply put, the community at Thessalonica, they are all Gentiles. They don't even know there is an Old Testament, much less would they know how to invest it with significance. So there are no Judaizers in Thessalonica. That wouldn't have made any sense. It's a purely Gentile reception of the gospel. So it's a gift to the New Testament canon in that regard. Number two, 1 Thessalonians depicts a purely Gentile church who remain true to their faith and outside the influence of false teachers. False teaching, not a problem in 1 Thessalonians. Instead, these Gentiles are tupoi. They are models of Christian belief for the entire surrounding region. And number three, 1 Thessalonians portrays the eschatological fervor that was typical of the early church. That eschatological fervor, we will see in a couple of units, will begin to cool a bit in the pastoral epistles. Instead, the focus will be more on church order, offices, ordination. The church will later on begin to settle in for the long haul, but in 1 Thessalonians, which is so similar to early Pentecostalism, they were living in a heated expectation for the second coming of Christ to occur within their lifetimes. Which is, of course, the perfect seg to talking about 1 Thessalonians in the context of early Pentecostalism. Of course, as you would expect, it was all about the second coming of Christ. Early Pentecostals regained that fervor for Christ's imminent return that the early church captured in 1 Thessalonians. They made it their own. I pray that it is still ours today as 21st century Pentecostals.